Webinar Babble. Hi, I am David Randall, Director of Research for the National Association of Scholars, and I would like to welcome you to our latest in our American Innovation, American Inventions webinar series. This is the internet. And by the way, we know that it's not purely American, but the Americans had a certain amount to do with this. I am delighted to have three distinguished panelists, and I'm not giving you everything they do, but ideally some of their books will be appearing in chat below in a little bit. But Dr. Martin Campbell-Kelly is an emeritus professor in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Warwick, where he specializes in the history of computing. And his books include Computer, A History of the Information Machine, and an extraordinary number of others, but he's, among other things, an editor of the collected works of Charles Babbage, which is great. Dr. Paul Ceruzzi retired in 2018 as a curator in the Space History Department at the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., and an extraordinarily long list of publications and honors. But books include Beyond the Limits, Flight Enters the Computer Age. And God, well, they're all interesting. I can't do them all. Dr. Shane Greenstein is the Martin Marshall Professor of Business Administration, teaching in the Technology Operations and Management Unit. And his works include How the Internet Became Commercial, Innovation, Privatization, and the Birth of a New Network. As I say, there are many other publications. They should be appearing in They have already been put into chat below. Everybody go buy all of them from Amazon, make Amazon a little richer and them much richer. The topic is, or the prompt is, guiding questions. Today, the internet is a necessity, an ever-present force that is connected to nearly everything, from cars to watches to refrigerators to this Zoom panel you're watching. We can access it anywhere at any time with our smartphones, and we can do a seemingly unlimited amount of things through it. But that wasn't always the case. What is the story behind the development of the internet? What was it intended to be, and how did it develop into the massive network of today? Now, format. Each of our speakers will speak for 12 to 14 minutes, and then there'll be a Q&A. The Q&A is done by you, the audience, putting your questions into either the chat or the Q&A. Frankly, it's a little bit more convenient if everybody chooses one or the other. And at this point, it looks like chat is where people have started. So that would be better, but not required. I will read in some order or another questions. They can also be read by our panelists who can talk with one another. If your questions don't get answered, don't worry. Send me email afterwards, randall@nas.org. I will be delighted to forward your questions to the panelists so they can have the option to answer you later. If you have to leave partway through, don't worry. This is being recorded for perpetuity on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel. You can drop out, watch the rest of this, forward the link to your friends, forward the link to your enemies, generally have access to this as long as you like. Having said all that, Dr. Campbell-Kelly, may I ask if you would go first?
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen and show a picture, I hope. I think that's working. Right, the title of this talk is American Innovation, the Internet. Well, it is an American innovation. It was created in the United States. But the ideas that the Internet embodies actually are international. And I'm going to talk about three British contributions to the present network age. So the three individuals are shown on the screen now. On the left is H.G. Wells, who's best known in the United States, I think, as a science fiction writer. Several films were made of his science fiction books, The Invisible Man, The Time Machine, The Shape of Things to Come, and quite a few more. That magazine cover is from 1940. He was a very prominent individual in the UK. On the top right there is a man called Donald Davis, who became head of computing at the National Physical Laboratory. The National Physical Laboratory, or the NPL, was the British equivalent of the National Bureau of Standards in the United States, and it did basic research and standards setting. Well, that photo is an interesting one. It's actually from June 1950, which is probably 15 years before the time when I'm going to talk about. But he's there having just invented a noughts and crosses, or tic-tac-toe playing machine, and is showing it to a group of schoolgirls. And I think the occasion is a soiree of the Royal Society. And on the bottom right there is Tim Berners-Lee, who's a much better known, I think, than these other figures currently, and who was, of course, the inventor of the World Wide Web. So let me talk about each of these. I'll stop my screen share now, and we can see each other again. Okay. Well, H.G. Wells, always known as H.G., although his name was Herbert, was born in 1866, and he was the UK's most famous author during his lifetime. He was also a pundit, he was a feminist, and he was a socialist. During the 1930s, when he was in his 60s, he conceived an idea that he called the world brain, and wrote several articles, gave lectures, and produced a little book, which is actually, you might just be able to see it, it's called The World Brain. And his idea was to use this new technology of microfilm, as it was then, to store all the world's knowledge from the great libraries of the world, so that it would become available to everybody. It was inspired in this vision by the encyclopedias of the 18th century. For example, the Britannica Encyclopedia started in 1768, and their aim had also been to deliver all the world's knowledge. Well, all in quotation marks. Let me read you a little quote from one of his lectures. And this is what he's envisaging with the world brain. The time is close at hand when any student in any part of the world will be able to sit with his projector in his own study at his or her convenience to examine any book, any document in an exact replica. Well, two interesting things there. First is the use of his or her, which was quite rare at that time. He was a feminist. And the idea that everybody would have access to information in their own homes. The technology would have been essentially using microfilm, which would be delivered to people. This was going to be a very costly project because you would need a myriad photographers to produce the microfilms, and a whole host of indexes to create indexes to access the material. So in the fall of 1937, Wells visited the United States to try and raise funds for this grand project. He gave several radio talks, some of which are reproduced in that book. And he also had lunch with President Roosevelt. But World War II was looming, and the US priorities were on other things at that time. So the project never did get funding. With the war beginning, Wells fell into a depression and he never really recovered from it. He died in 1946 at the age of 80. Well, his idea didn't die with him. It fed into his subsequent efforts. So, for example, in the United States, Vannevar Bush, an important scientist, also developed systems using microfilm. But really, the whole technology had to await the computer before it was truly practical. I turn then to our second character, Donald Davis, at the National Physical Laboratory. He was born in 1924, had a very distinguished career. He started as a mathematician, became a computer scientist and was one of the first to be elected to the Royal Society in 1987, in his case, one of the leading scientific society in the UK. Well, one of the key technologies of the internet is the idea of packet switching. And it was Donald Davis who gave the name to that particular technology. Now, when you watch a streaming service, for example, on your TV set, you will have the illusion of an unbroken transmission being sent direct to your TV set, no stops, no starts. In fact, what's actually happening is that you are being sent minuscule packets of data, like little telegrams, a stream of them, which are then reassembled by the computer inside your television set. Well, the idea of packet switching was invented independently in the 1960s by Paul Barron, working at the Rand Corporation in the United States, and Donald Davis at the National Physical Laboratory in London. The NPL was building a time-shared computer system, which was a technology of the 1960s by which an expensive mainframe computer could be accessed by typewriter terminals, which were distributed all around the country. Well, the problem was that each of those remote typewriters had to be connected by a long-distance telephone line, which was extremely expensive. And Davis' idea was to have several terminals sharing a single long-distance line, which would carry the conversations with the computer simultaneously. Well, there was a problem with that because it could happen that one of the users would monopolize the telephone line for a long period. For example, they might be printing a long document and that would tie up the line perhaps for several minutes, stopping everybody else. So David's idea was to break each message up into a series of packets of just a few characters and send those down the telephone line. In that way, every conversation was split up into packets, sent down the telephone line, and all the conversations were interleaved. At the other end, a computer would reassemble the original packets and produce coherent messages again. Well, Davis hoped to interest the General Post Office in this idea. At that time, the General Post Office was responsible for postal and telecommunication services, as they were in most countries in Europe. Unfortunately, he couldn't interest them. Lack of funding, lack of interest. It really had to await the privatization of the post office in the early 80s. Well, while Davis was solving the long-distance telephone line problem in the UK, the people who were pioneering the internet, it was called the ARPANET then, were having exactly the same problem. And it happened that one of Donald Davis's colleague, a man called Roger Scantlebury, was attending a conference on computer operating systems in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, in October 1967. And it was there that he met Larry Roberts, who was directing the ARPANET project. And he explained this idea of packet switching to him. Well, to quote Roberts, "Suddenly I learned how to route packets." And really that was one of the key technologies that shaped the internet. Well, I move on to the third person, Tim Berners-Lee. When the internet began to take off in the early 90s, there were a number of different ways of accessing it. Basically, it was rather as H.G. Wells had envisaged at the time, there would be a whole host of documents stored on computers that you could access in your machine. Obviously, things like internet commerce had not yet arrived. Well, one way of doing it was using a system called Gopher, which was developed by the University of Minnesota. There was another system called Archie, developed at McGill University. There was a system called WACE, developed by the Thinking Machines Corporation. And there were several other similar technologies, all now largely forgotten. And they all suffered from the same problem, that they required a master index in order to be able to access different documents. So, for example, you would be reading a document, there would be a footnote referring to another document, and what you would then have to do would be to come out of the document you were reading, go back to the master index, locate that document, and then download it. So what Tim Berners-Lee came up with the idea of using what came to be called hypertext, so that simply to go to another document, you would just click on a link inside the document. So there would be no external master index of all the documents on the web. Everything would be self-documenting in that sense. Well, let me tell you a little bit about Tim Berners-Lee. He was has a rather interesting background. His parents actually were both computer pioneers. His father was a man called Conway Berners-Lee, and his mother was called Mary Woods, who became Mary Woods-Lee after they were married. She died just a few months ago, actually, and there was an obituary in the Guardian, if you're interested. Well, Conway and Mary were both computing pioneers in the 1950s at Ferranti Computers in Manchester. And it was, of course, Ferranti that created the for sale version of the Manchester baby computer. Well, I must say they were some of the kindest people I ever met. In the 1970s, about 1977, I was researching my PhD on the history of programming, and I wanted to interview his parents, Conway and Mary. So instead of me going down, they set up a dinner party for me and invited two other Ferranti pioneers. And we had a really lovely evening when they were telling me all the anecdotes and stories of the internet. This was in their house in Richmond, a nice suburb of London. Well, I learned a great deal that night, but I think it's Tim, by the way, had just graduated at that time. He was aged in his early 20s at that time. Well, I think it's fair to say at that dinner party, none of us would have guessed that 30 years down the line, he would be Sir Tim Berners-Lee, Fellow of the Royal Society, Order of Merit, Britain's highest honour, and one of Time's 100 greatest people of the 20th century. Well, what happened? Just at that time, as I was having dinner with his parents, he had finished taking a degree in physics at Oxford University and had obtained a 6-month fellowship at CERN, the nuclear physics laboratory in Geneva, Switzerland. And during that 6 months, he came up with the idea of using hypertext to develop a system. This was well before it was possible to network such things. And he called his system Enquire. And it was named after a family book. We have a copy in our house and did as a child, called Enquire Within Upon Everything. And it was a domestic book of recipes and so forth. Anyway, he then got his 6 months internship was over at CERN, and he got a job actually coding software for dot matrix printers, something really quite tedious. But fortunately, by 1984, he got a permanent position at CERN, and that was when he came up with a prototype for the World Wide Web. He was working with a colleague, Robert Calu, and they both got funding for this idea to develop a hypertext system for accessing the internet. Well, he and Robert submitted a paper to a conference called Hypertext 91, which was held in San Antonio, Texas. In a wonderful irony, their paper was rejected. but they did manage to give a demonstration of the system. Well, as they say, the rest is history. And as Tim Berners-Lee later remarked, at the next Hypertext conference, Hypertext 93, every project on display had something to do with the World Wide Web. I'll finish there.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. I'm going to go on to our next speaker then, Dr. Ceruzzi.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me. This is, if everybody can hear me okay, it's a big question for all historians. It's sort of, where do you begin? You know, you begin with the abacus or you begin with dinosaurs or something. And some people have pointed out that the Morse telegraph had a lot of qualities of networking and communication and all of that in the 19th century. So where do I begin? Well, I want to point out, before I go to the internet, I want to talk about a very important network that was constructed in the United States in the 1950s. It was called SAGE, Semi-Automatic Ground Environment. That's a real mouthful. It was a network of computers and other radar and other systems to detect and intercept a potential attack by the Soviet Union over the polar regions into the United States. It had some of the largest computers in the world, built by IBM using vacuum tubes, thousands of vacuum tubes. And these SAGE systems were scattered around the United States and connected to all these sensors all over, including from aircraft and radar installations and so forth. It was quite an accomplishment. It had a tremendous impact on the history of computing. As far as network is, I want to focus on the topic of today of networking. It had an interesting quality, if you want to call it that, and this is not really in the histories of SAGE, that if such an attack were to occur, it probably would not have worked. It probably would have overloaded. And there is a phrase that's common. It was common. I don't know whether it's a formal phrase or not in the telephone industry, called the Mother's Day problem. That is to say, on Mother's Day, everybody wants to call their mother and say Happy Mother's Day. And this was at a time when telephone circuits were circuit switched, that you had to establish a circuit between you and your mother, wherever she was. And if everybody did that, the phone company couldn't handle the calls. The calls wouldn't go through. It was saturated. And Martin Campbell-Kelly talked about how packet switching was devised as a way of getting around that. The programming for SAGE was done at a place called System Development Corporation in Santa Monica, California. Just down the road from SDC was the RAND Corporation, where Paul Barron, as Martin mentioned, independently came up with the idea of packet switching. This has led to this myth that the internet was invented to wage a nuclear war. And I've talked to Paul Barron about this, and he said explicitly, no, that's not true. It was intended to prevent a nuclear war. That is to say, if there was a crisis that was slowly building up tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, packet switching would allow leaders from both sides to communicate with one another and not get a busy signal, literal or figurative busy signal. So the SAGE was a kind of predecessor of networking. It's long gone now, although there are packet switch networks. Of course, I won't go into that. So where would I want to begin the internet story? I like to begin in 1962, when there was a conference held at a luxurious resort in the mountains of Virginia, the Homestead, where people were talking about military communications and military uses of computers. The meeting didn't go very well. In those days, there was a dedicated train from the Homestead to Washington, D.C. And after the conference, people got on the train, and they didn't have cell phones. They couldn't have any distractions. One of the people on the train was a man named J.C.R. Licklider. He had been a professor at Harvard and then had become a leader of a division of ARPA, Advanced Research Projects Agency, the Information Processing Technology Office. He had two things. One was money, Defense Department money, and I can go into that later if time. The second was a vision. He had a vision of using the computer as a communications device. And it was the purpose of a computer, in his view, was not to compute, but to communicate. And at the end of that train trip, he instituted a program which eventually became something called Project MAC, Machine-Aided Cognition at MIT, based on time sharing, the idea of sharing an expensive resource with terminals. I always like to use the metaphor of simultaneous chess. A grandmaster can play a whole number of chess players who aren't as good and defeat each one by moving from one to the other. Each chess player thinks he or she is playing chess directly with this grandmaster, regardless of the other people at the table. Anyway, so time sharing had its day in the sun, but it had its drawbacks. And meanwhile, as Martin mentioned, this concept evolved to a network which was called ARPANET. And maybe we could call up that slide, Kaylee, if you can, with a picture of this is what the ARPANET looked like in 1978. So it had already been in place, and it's a little bit, I hope people can read it okay. I'm going to try to, a couple of points. I want to make 2 points about this logical map of the ARPANET. One is that if you can read it, you'll see that many of the nodes of the ARPANET were military installations. So it is in some sense a descendant of SAGE. The universities that are there are all restricted to top-level universities, Stanford, MIT, Harvard, UCLA. Very few other universities had the privilege of being connected to the ARPANET. There are two very interesting satellite links, one to Hawaii on the upper left, and three actually, one to London and one to Norway on the lower right. The one to Norway, again, was to connect to possible surveillance of Soviet activities in the Arctic. So we are still in the military here. And I guess the point is that the internet as we know it today, of course the military is involved, but we think of it as Instagram, Facebook, Amazon buying books and stuff. It's the military presence has faded into the background, even though it's extremely important, as I don't have to emphasize. But how did that transition happen from the ARPANET, as we see here, to the internet? And that came from another source altogether. It's like two ships were passing in the night. That while this was going on with very high-level machines, and you can look at them, digital equipment, PDP-11, IBM System 370, Unisys, Sperry Univac, all those other machines, most of those companies are gone. IBM is still around, but they had to restructure themselves. What was going on at the same time in 1978? Well, the Apple II computer, for one. The IBM PC came out a few years later. The personal computer was coming from the bottom up. And the personal computer originally was also, it was for computing, but people were very enthusiastic about networking and communications. It was a very grassroots kind of activity. Long distance phone calls were very expensive in the United States at that time, but local calls were free. People could connect a modem to their personal computer, and I did this personally. I had a K-Pro, 8-bit computer. You could dial a local number, and then the local number could connect to a network like CompuServe or Prodigy or AOL. These are also long gone, or AOL I think is still around. At least the suffix is still around. But these people, personal computer enthusiasts, didn't have to concern themselves with the protocols or the proper use of the network as military people. The military people couldn't just chat and talk about baseball games or anything like that. Personal computer users talked about anything, including commerce and communications and culture. And the two cultures were separate. I said like two ships passing in the night. Eventually they would merge. They merged, and you can look at that map again, what happened to all those mainframe companies that pretty much faded away. What happened was the personal computer kept getting better and better, especially with Intel Pentium processors getting more powerful processors. Microsoft hired a software programmer from Digital Equipment named Dave Cutler to develop an operating system, Windows NT. Essentially, the personal computer came to have all the capabilities of those super mini computers that we see in this map. And that's the world we have today. If you look at where the internet is today, it consists of data centers that consists of racks and racks of servers that are microprocessor based. Many of them descendants of the Intel microprocessor, but others as well. Networked by fiber optic cables, another new development that was not in existence in the early days of ARPANET, to terminals, laptop computers, phones, other devices, all of which use microprocessors of some form or another. So it's the culture of the internet, to me, is just as important as the technical aspect of developing packet switching, the internet protocols that were developed by Vint Cerf and Robert Kahn, that allowed it to scale. And I think, to me, what's the biggest story of the internet is that it scaled up so well. Sage had that saturation problem. The internet is still going strong based on these protocols that were developed in the 1980s, quite a long time ago. And if you do a little detailed history of the internet, you'll see that there have been some close calls where it has almost collapsed. There was a very famous instance of an internet worm developed, unleashed on the internet by a student, Robert Morris, whose father, incidentally, or not coincidentally, worked at the National Security Agency. And it crashed the internet, mainly exploiting a flaw in the fact that so many of the nodes on it were manufactured by the same company, Digital Equipment Corporation. Well, that's long gone, but it had this effect of waking people up, say, hey, we got to take this thing seriously. So here we are today. I emphasize the laptop and the phone and everything, but of course there's a lot of serious other uses of the internet by banks, railroads, airlines, and all of that, and they don't do it all on a laptop, although they probably could, but they don't. So, but to us, we think of the internet, we use it every day. So, crazy world, crazy long, strange trip we've been on, and here we are. Where are we going to go from here? I don't know. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And now we will go to our third speaker, Dr. Greenstein.
Thanks. Here, I'm addicted to slides, so that's, if that's okay. Does that look okay?
Works by me.
Okay, great. Thank you for having me. So if I understand the question of the day, is what's the story behind the development of the internet and what was it intended to be and how did it develop into a massive network? Today, I'm going to focus mostly on the development of the commercial network. So we have ordered ourselves from, I'm going to focus on the most recent. I also should say in the beginning, I'm going to be very US centric, partially because I'm going to mostly focus on the 90s and my book from several years ago, and I'll focus on 4 observations. So the first place I'd like to start is with, I just love to start here with this newspaper ad from 1991, and this is coming from Radio Shack, If any of you recall Radio Shack, it was the largest retailer, in-person retailer of electronics. And if you look at this ad and spend some time studying it, you would find that everything on this ad can be done on your smartphone. So you can make a phone call, you can record, store, play, and listen to music. You can record, store, and play a video. You can take a picture, record it. You can play a range of games and calculate the tip on a bill. The fascinating thing I find about this ad is the additional things you can do on your smartphone, which you don't see in this ad, including send, receive, email, and text, access social media, find the best route around traffic, purchase a product, get on a plane or into a venue without a ticket, and keep reminders of your appointments. And the point behind starting here is to say no single person foresaw nor could have architected all these changes in advance. And nor could anyone have forecast when the changes would arrive, what the identity of the firm who would supply it would be, and what the market value of those services would be. And I want to stress that because in the 1990s, when this wonderful technology starts to commercialize and at large scale, it takes on a form that no one foresaw coming. And if you ask yourself, why did that happen? With the benefit of hindsight, one of the things I would stress is dispersed technical knowledge about the core technology. It was not concentrated. The understanding of how it worked and how to manipulate it to achieve goals was not concentrated in a small number of people, nor a small number of firms. And that led to, for the communications industry and for communications technology, an unprecedented degree of specialization and number of sources of revenue. And I always like to enumerate some of those revenue sources just to remind people what you kind of already know with the benefit of retrospect, but let's at least look at it. You can make money on the internet by selling subscriptions, say to video or music services. There are, that's on the scale of tens of billions of dollars today, by the way, right? You can make money on the internet today as an advertiser. The two largest providers of the ad auctions for advertising, Google and Facebook, make several $100 billion of revenue doing that per year. You can sell access to households and businesses and content providers. Carriers and ISPs make on the order more than $100 billion in the US doing that. You can sell electronic commerce over the internet. Now, the revenue for that is over $1 trillion. The value added of doing it online versus not online is, of course, much smaller than that. But the point being, nonetheless, it's a huge amount of economic activity. I'll just pick a couple of obscure additional things. You can be a content provider or a CDN. That's a hosting content in order to reduce latency. The order of magnitude of that today is a couple $2 billion in revenue. Or you can sell co-location services for CDNs, or you can ISPs pay each other for transit on data, other transactions that are sort of invisible to us. And my point is, there's just an enormous number of different actors in the economy, all of whom have access to the same basic technical knowledge and engineer different kinds of transactions using it. And the thing we call the internet is today this massive collection of those activities. The second thing that I'd emphasize, if you look back with the benefit of hindsight, is that we got that dispersed technical knowledge in part because government and industry policies eliminated technical barriers. And in part, it was unanticipated what the effect would be. And in part, it was explicitly to encourage innovative initiatives. I talk a lot about this in my book, so I'm just going to sort of summarize. When the internet first commercialized, there were attempts to monopolize it. There were attempts to slow down ISP entry. policy stopped it. There's just no other way to read the history other than to say policy was there to encourage more entry and less monopoly. There's a long history in communication services of using interconnection data exchange, or exchanges, not necessarily data exchange, for anti-competitive purposes, and policy again prevented it. An additional thing that policy did, government-funded research, some of which has already been mentioned, and that's wonderful. It's nice. I don't have to mention all of it. Both on not just in the U.S., but actually quite a bit around the world, developed non-proprietary technology, which set the stage for many internet firms. Again, I'll focus on U.S. firms just for this purpose. I'm naming a few very prominent firms in the 90s: PSINet, Yahoo, Akamai, Google, Netscape, and Cisco, all of whom really have their origins in government funding. And then the thing that often is not stressed very much, which is the private consortia that standardize open designs with no restriction on use of the technology and no restriction on who could see it. The World Wide Web Consortium has already been mentioned as an incredibly significant player in this. I would also stress the IEEE for establishing standards that were used in things like Ethernet and Wi-Fi. Finally, one other observation I would say is, and I say this about U.S. markets, I want to be very clear, and it's a remark about the 90s primarily, a little bit of the post-millennial era as well, is that it, for a communications market, was remarkably receptive to outsiders. And here, I just want to give a couple examples. So, for example, you could classify some of them as entry by firms who came from outside a prevailing view. And once they were entered and they were established, typically these were not instantaneous entry events. They took quite some time. It left established firms without much of a viable competitive response. And if you were to look, for example, at Google or Encarta, Wikipedia, Craigslist, Netflix, they all have this kind of story behind them. There's also quite a few really rather important events where entrepreneurs catalyzed a response from established industries. And I'll use a couple examples. For example, the Apple Airport, which is the first router, commercial router, it's well documented, motivated the largest PC provider in the world, Dell Computer, to also have its own branded Wi-Fi service, which then generated a massive response among all computer providers and spread Wi-Fi across all laptops just after the turn of the millennium. Another famous example from the 90s is the establishment of Netscape, definitely catalyzed response out of Microsoft to develop Internet Explorer. And then there's just an enormous number of stories, and I don't have time for all of them, about e-commerce, all the e-commerce that during the dot-com boom generating a huge amount of middleware responses out of established firms. Even on top of that, there are some stories. This market is quite unusual for established firms renewing themselves. I'll just use a couple of examples. Amazon was a leading firm already before it started AWS. And AWS today is its most profitable line and service. That's really extraordinary to have an established firm do something like that. Another example, well known, of course, is the Apple iPod was already quite a successful product and became the foundation for the next upgrade to the iPhone. And that catalyzed quite a large response across the phone industry. Again, quite unusual if you look at other markets. To see communications markets be that dynamic, I just, again, want to stress, by comparison with history, communications market is quite impressive, and with comparison to other communications markets in other developed nations, it's also quite impressive. It is, however, half full kind of observation. Having said that, if anybody who studied this carefully recognizes there are communities who have no role in this dynamism, or very small role, like disadvantaged locations, isolated rural areas or poor urban areas, particular needs that don't don't get addressed. Specific needs of the elderly and technically unsophisticated, and female entrepreneurs. It's always hard to be an entrepreneur. It's the evidence to be a female entrepreneur, even in the United States, which is quite welcoming to entrepreneurs. To be a female entrepreneur is extraordinarily difficult. So I just want to say again, there was 4 observations. Oh, I said 5. No, I had 4. First, nobody foresaw what would result from commercialization. Dispersed technical knowledge helped for an unprecedented degree of specialization and an enormous number of revenue sources. And that's important. Government industry policies eliminated technical barriers and encouraged innovative initiatives. And finally, that internet markets were receptive to outsiders, certainly more so than any prior communications market. Okay.
Thank you so much, all. Now, I'm going to encourage everyone who is watching, send in your questions so that we can have it be more than just yours truly. But I will start up with one. I want to pick up on that international bit, in particular, the role of the IEEE in setting standards was fascinating for me. And I guess I'd like to follow up on how did an international organization set standards for something which was primarily American in origin, the technology? How did Americans think through having their inventions work for an international organization? And I will just broaden that, this whole question of how does something which is primarily but not exclusively coming from America fit into the broader world, where, for example, in the military, for example, was there thought about how to integrate this computer architecture into the militaries of our NATO allies, for example? And some similar question will be for Dr. Dr. Campbell-Kelly. But if we could start maybe with the IEEE and how that worked.
Can I use a particular example?
Yeah.
It's a very big question you're asking.
Okay, sure.
I'll use Wi-Fi in particular. Wi-Fi is very much a 802.11. The committee 802.11, very much an international effort. So from the beginning, the chair of that committee is Dutch, for example, and works for a division of NCR, which was then acquired by AT&T. And it's quite an interesting story. Their initial motive for developing wireless local area networks, which is what their goal was, his goal was for wireless cash registers. So it's apparently quite a challenge in a retail space to wire your back office computer to your cash register. And anytime you want to move things around, that was the problem they were looking at in 1991 when they first started. To move things around required moving all the wires around, and that was quite difficult. And if they could get local wireless communication, that would be a big benefit to the sellers of cash registers. That was their motive. They teamed up with academics who were doing wireless services at Carnegie Mellon, that is in a campus environment, and with a few others. And then they teamed up further with an initiative at the US government at the time to add more unused spectrum to what was then called unlicensed spectrum, which you might remember was being used at the time for garage door openers and baby monitors and wireless handsets. You could walk around your house without a wire. And the Federal Communications Commission added more spectrum to those low-powered uses under the hope that private industry would develop new uses for low-powered spectrum. And the Wi-Fi committee, the 802 committee, picked up on that in 1997 and added that. And by 1999, had a workable standard for wireless low-powered communication. And Steve Jobs, to his credit, knew about this, learned about it right away, called up the people in Holland, in the Netherlands, who were working for at that point Lucent, and said he wanted to get a card for his product that he was going to call, commercial wireless system. And he was looking just for anything at that point. He had only returned to Apple. He was looking for anything that distinctive for the Apple computer, because that company was on the verge of bankruptcy at that point. And he went ahead and it famously on stage took out a hoop and took out the computer and put the hoop around the computer and showed that there were no wires, and got a huge amount of attention. So what's that all about? So IEEE, my point is the IEEE is this little committee. It had its own little reasons to do it, and it was developing something that others recognized was valuable. It was also had help from the FCC at the same time, and that came together to get us what we today call the beginning of Wi-Fi. And the IEEE has these norms. It has to have open standards. That is to say, no one is excluded from learning about them, and there's no restrictions on how they're used. So again, that ends up supporting dispersed technical standards and dispersed technical knowledge, and lots of entry.
Thank you. And to the same question, the interface between American and international, electronics for either or both of the other two speakers.
Well, one thing that has always interested me is that in Europe, particularly, there was a sort of a rival to the internet standards. It was what was called the 7-layer model, which was potentially more secure than the internet model. And what seemed to happen was that the European efforts got mired in bureaucracy. It was excessively complex, well, not excessively complex. In retrospect, it probably would have been a much safer internet than the one we currently have. And the internet standards in the US were based on a 3-layer model. So you can imagine it was significantly less complex. But the standards were ratified through the IEEE and various other organizations. And basically, the internet protocols got there first. And in the nature of those things, it's a winner-takes-all situation, classic network effects. So that the European efforts simply got lost.
Thank you. Dr.
I think that's correct. Would you agree with that, Shane?
Actually sounds right. Yeah.
There's sort of an interesting anecdote about that is that then Senator Al Gore, later Vice President, proposed funding for networking, and he wrote that he saw the existing protocols, TCP/IP, as, in his view, interim, would soon be replaced by the system that Martin mentioned, which you can speculate forever about. We wouldn't have spam, we wouldn't have phishing, we wouldn't have all these troubles that we have. Well, you can say that, but Al Gore was one of these people who sort of thought, oh yeah, this is a nice little experiment, but we're going to move to something serious soon. With my funding, he championed this funding, the Gore bill, which was signed into law by the elder President Bush, and he's been sort of made fun of for his statement about the internet, but he actually did have a very important role.
Yeah. One day we'll do it properly.
Thank you. I am going to go to a question from the audience, and more questions from the audience, please. From M. Nasca, a question for Shane. Would you please elaborate on support for female and immigrant entrepreneurs? And going on beyond Sergey is, I think, the subtitle.
Well, first, I almost want to ask the other panelists, because there's a long-standing, got deep historical roots in the computer industry about why it became such a male-oriented field, which I don't think I have the right background for. So I mean, I'm going to sort of say, by the time I was paying attention in the 1990s, the computer industry had become a male-oriented field, and the venture capital industry, the commercial-oriented side, had also acquired quite a male-oriented bias. And there's some, deep social reasons for that. And it's sort of well documented that it was quite difficult for female entrepreneurs to get financial backing, and at every stage in the process, and then get first evaluations. There's one of my colleagues did this really wonderful experiment where both female and male entrepreneurs are putting their products out for review, first review. VCs are watching the first reviews, but 90% of the reviewers are men. And so the men systematically don't appreciate the products oriented towards female needs and perspectives. And so unremarkably, I think in light of that, the VCs see the feedback and then disproportionately fund the products oriented towards male entrepreneurs. And so the remark is, at every stage of commercialization, you see the things set up in a way that make it very challenging for female entrepreneurs in this part of the technology world. That's just it boggles the mind, because that's 50% of our users out there. And why should it be that way? What are all the missed services and products and things that could be there? Were they funded? That's a kind of an interesting question. So I some of the historical roots of it, I almost want to defer to others. As for immigration, let's be clear what we're talking about. We're talking about to use a U.S. term, high-skilled immigration. Because immigration debates are often sloppy, and I want to be very precise here. That is, the U.S. has had a comparatively open and friendly approach to anybody with a master's degree or a PhD. And there are processes in place. They still are in place for almost anybody from almost any country. There's a little bit of discrimination now that didn't used to be present. I think you'll find there's one of these statistics that I always like to quote is the largest concentration of Hindus in the United States is in the Silicon Valley. And there's a reason for it. Is because there's so much Indian immigration into that area of talented engineers and programmers. It's just the country has been quite willing to take talented immigrants. Anybody who gets a master's degree inside the United States can get through the immigration limits. Now, there are other parts of the immigration that are quite restrictive, and I don't want to overstate this, but that's what I mean by being very immigrant friendly. And again, it's just pretty well documented. It's just a huge number of startups, large number of the talent is coming from abroad. So that's sort of very simple. It's a huge topic, but trying to give something simple.
If you go back to the 1950s, programming was not dominated by women, but women were very well represented in it. I mentioned earlier that Tim Berners-Lee's mother was an early programmer. And certainly at firms like Ferranti, there was a kind of an ethos, I would say, that soldering irons were for boys and coding was for girls, I think was sort of one way of summarizing it. And I had to be careful in overgeneralizing, but I think one of the things that happened was that, if we just took, for example, Mary Woods Lee, Tim's mother, she was a coder at Ferranti, but then became a homemaker. And that was quite a typical trajectory for the early programmers who tended to start immediately after graduating in the UK. She subsequently became a mathematics teacher in a school and never went back into the industry. One of our most prominent software firms was founded by another homemaker, actually, same thing, so that women could work from home. So there was, in the 1950s and 60s, it was actually very hard for women to find a working role. I'm speaking in the UK, but I think that generalizes to the United States a bit as well. When computer science degrees started, they were strongly associated with mathematics and with physics schools, university schools. And again, they were very male orientated. Just speaking from personal experience, when I taught at Warwick University, and we had a computer science degree. And in the hard computer science degree, something under 10% of the enrollment were female and 90% male amongst the students. When I was there, I worked with the business school, and we established a computing and business studies degree. And on that degree, we actually had slightly more women than men, which is we were all stunned by it, actually, that was the result. And it was something to do with the culture in Britain, I guess, that women found hard technology a bit, and the attitudes that went with it, somewhat repellent, I think. And we're much more attracted by the softer skills of systems analysis and business processes rather than the soldering irons. I'm generalizing vastly, you appreciate.
Thank you. Anybody else on this topic? If not, I will go to the next question, which is from Candice Citrone. Do you think development of the internet as we know it today was more hardware or software driven? And you're not allowed to say yes, both, or it's complex. Well, I suppose you are, but you notice that people will be glaring at you. To any and all.
I'll jump in and say that the one of the topics that's not addressed as much as it should be is the development of fiber optic cables. That the original ARPANET and early internet used microwave or wire, copper wire, microwave satellites overseas, and they worked. They still are in use today, but the order of magnitude of fiber optic really made a huge difference. You had, I have some anecdotes I can talk about where there was a situation in Southeast Asia where a fishing trawler or something cut a fiber optic cable between the Philippines and the mainland of China. So they ended up sending the internet all the way around the world the other way, and it worked fine. Nobody really noticed that there was a problem. So that is a story. A lot of it is developed at Bell Laboratories and also Corning Glass in New York, and that's a hardware issue, obviously, and it doesn't sound like it's not a computer. What is glass? But it had a huge, and it still is. I just learned that Google has financed their own private fiber undersea cable from Europe to the United States. It's landing in Southern Virginia, near where I live, and that's the number of cables underneath the Atlantic is staggering. And each time they lay a new cable, it's kind of a version of Moore's Law. It has more capacity than about 5 or 6 cables of the previous year. So, so it's a interesting phenomenon. I don't know where it's going from here, but it's important.
I will just interject before the others. If anybody is in the upstate New York area, the Corning Glass Museum actually has an excellent exhibit on the birth of fiber optic. You could read a book, but for public history, that's actually really worth going to, along with the rest of the Corning Glass Museum. product placement. Did anybody else want to talk about this hardware, software?
Yeah, I have. I actually completely agree with Paul. That fiber optics was a very key invention. So just to be provocative, I would say in the 90s, neither hardware nor software were the defining bottleneck on development. It was legal, and privatization of the backbone was a big problem, and it was very difficult to do in the US. And then the second thing that was very much legal was the rules defining sending data over telephone lines, on a modem, if you remember those days. The illustration I always use for this is the memo that Bill Gates wrote in the spring of 1995, when he first used the Netscape browser and realized that things had developed much faster than he had anticipated. It was just that the capabilities were well beyond where he had expected them to be. And he wrote why he had made that mistake. I mean, it's kind of fascinating. You can see it in the memo. And he was convinced that this capability was not going to rise until ISDN, which was very much a hardware solution to the reaching the home, until that was deployed, which he was anticipating was not going to happen until 1999 or beyond. And here he was in 1995. There was a dial-up solution that legally had accomplished what he didn't think was going to be possible for many, many more years. And so I sometimes joke that, no, it was legal that really did it to make it possible. And there's, of course, a bit of story behind that, but that's just to be provocative.
Sometimes things that look like hardware are actually software. So to take the example of packet switching I talked about earlier, it looks like hardware because you've got lots of conversations going down a single line, but it's actually all being done by software.
Well, I don't know if we're getting up to more recent years, but the development of database software, things like so-called Hadoop and other programs which allow traditional databases couldn't handle the massive amounts of big data that AI and other applications require. Hadoop and other software allows you to have the illusion that you have one big giant database, and actually it's spread over hundreds of servers. You don't even know how many they are, and that allows this kind of growth that we're seeing today, pioneered by Google, but also these artificial intelligence firms, which is way beyond out of my pay scale. But anyway, it's what's happening now, and to me, I think it's a software. The hardware is microprocessor servers, just stacked up one on top of each other, but the software is what manages them.
Thank you. I'm going to go to another question, unless people desperately want to answer something from this, but from John Lawrence Bush. A number of internet pioneers, including Louis Pouzin and many others, have declared that the internet should be reinvented to be more secure and less chaotic. Where does that stand in relation to the existing history of the development of the internet? To any and all.
I just don't think it's going to happen.
It's too late.
The only way it could happen is if it collapsed, which would be a worldwide disaster. But Martin and Shane might know more than me about how there were some very close calls. Somebody discovered a flaw and they fixed it overnight in some crazy patch. If something like that were to happen, but otherwise, no, it's not going to happen.
I think it's too difficult. We drive on the left-hand side of the road, and you drive on the other side, which is incredibly inconvenient for us. But there's sort of nothing we can do about it at this stage. I think it was, I I think it was Norway that was in the same position. And what they did was I think it was on New Year's Eve, they switched all the roadsides and everybody couldn't drive for a day. And when they got out the next day, they had to drive on the other side. But you would have to something truly radical in order to you basically have to tear down the existing internet and put up a new one, and you'd have to do it over a weekend.
Let me actually push this a little bit. I will interrupt. Don't we, in point of fact, have a number of rival communications within the United States Army, the United States government, foreign armies and governments, which are, not supposed to be connected? The question is, are any of them, in point of fact, experimenting with system, hardware, software, which is in any ways superior, at least for the security and the lack of chaos, and which can somehow be used as a model for, reinventing the internet elsewhere, or can it only be for that sort of private purpose? And actually, how much do we know, in point of fact, about these various government and military systems? Is the answer it's so classified that we can't speak about it properly?
I don't think we do know, but I'm sure you're quite right that there are interesting technologies out there and are more secure. But I think the problem would be actually making the transition. I can't quite imagine how it would be done. It would be a bit like having to go from an analog telephone system to a digital one. It's a very big project indeed, and on a much bigger scale than the phones going from analog to digital.
I mean, I can only think of one example in contemporary where a government, a large sovereign government, is trying to reshape their internet, and I don't think it's for the better. And that's the Chinese government is quite deliberately disengaging from the worldwide internet in multiple ways. Aside from just the firewall that everyone knows about, they've deliberately invested in their own GitHub imitator so that all the data is locally stored. They're not far away from being able to do what many internet idealists would regard as a nightmare, which is they can put out their own domain name system and just run everything internally and don't have to fully interact with the international internet. That system is going to be more secure at some level, but I don't know that that's for the better of the world. That there is that happening right now. North Korea also, for all intent and purposes, is pretty much cut off from the rest of the internet, and they're very secure. But I don't know that any of us regard that as an improvement.
Indeed. So perhaps security is not necessarily good. Chaos is perhaps liberty and freedom.
Well, trade-offs. Let's say it that way. Yeah.
Let's see. And there's also. Did anybody else want to speak about this subject? I'm also getting comments from Aaron Ray about Hedy Lamarr and Grace Hopper, who are indeed, contributors. How should I put this actually? Is there, in point of fact, a narrow narrative of the history of all this that needs to be revised? Or do, in point of fact, historians and the public have a reasonably good sense of the history? But let me put it a different way. What are the things that the public thinks it knows or doesn't know, which most need to be corrected?
Wow.
There is obviously a lot of misinformation. Yes, I think if I could get on my soapbox, I think that the stuff that you read in the public in the newspapers about AI and Chat GPT is just ridiculous. Okay, I said it, and you can disagree with me, you will, but I find it laughably easy to fool it by asking it a simple question about the history of computers, which has been my career, or aerospace, the same thing. And yet you see these ridiculous comments about what AI is going to do to us, and I think that there's a problem, and maybe I'm guilty that we haven't educated the public very well about what we've got in front of us, and it goes all the way back. There's a lot of history here with Joe Weizenbaum and the program ELIZA, which had the problem. It was written on a IBM mainframe, but it goes back to the early days of the internet with the man Doug Engelbart, the co-inventor of the mouse, and one of the inventors of the kind of interactivity of Windows or whatever you kind of like hypertext. He had ARPA funding. He was at the Stanford Research Institute, and he had a very tough time. There was this prevailing wisdom that they were going to make computers artificially intelligent, and they were going to be able to do all kinds of autonomous jobs. And Engelbart said, no, that's not what computers are. They're supposed to be a symbiosis with human beings. They do what they're good at, and human beings do what we're good at. And he told me that he had a proposal he submitted to ARPA that was rejected. It came back to him, and inadvertently someone had handwritten on the back of the paper, "Stay away from this crazy nut." He was right. I think we now realize that the power of computers is that they're a tool that work with human beings, and the more we can educate people like that, I think the better off the world will be.
Yeah, I think, judging by the shake of heads, I think all three of us are agreed that the current fears are overstated. There have actually been two what were called AI winters. There was one in the early 70s where the predictions for AI had been so overblown, all the funding was withdrawn. Again, in the 1980s, the Japanese launched what they called their 5th generation project, and the whole AI thing was revived, particularly around expert systems, as they were called at the time. And again, they completely overpromised and underdelivered. And there was another AI winter. And my prediction, I think you're agreeing with me, that we're heading straight into the 3rd AI winter sometime in the middle of this decade.
So I have a little joke about that at the time of that Japanese initiative, that the prevailing acronym was MIPS, millions of instructions per second. And somehow in the Japanese one, it came out as LIPS, logical instructions per second. Somehow nobody thought that was like a funny acronym, but I do anyway. But that sort of faded away. Yeah.
I one other remark about myths. So I am trained as an economist, so let me give an economics strain to this. The internet that we have today has a characteristic that's comparatively rare among industries, where zero price or the price of zero plays an important role in both sometimes as an input and other times as an output. So as an output, you are quite familiar with this. Every time you use Google, you don't have to pay for it. Rather, you have to watch advertising. And so there's a price of zero for its use. And as an input, you probably aren't paying attention to it, but the spectrum over which you use Wi-Fi, you don't pay for. It's unlicensed. There's a price of zero. For some reason, I still think this is fascinating. This industry has zero price in it, with much more prevalence than you find in other industries. And that creates the problem that I see a lot as an economist, which is you have inputs like ideas, which are not priced, Doug Engelbart's idea, and nobody has to pay to use it. And you have, Linux systems, which are basically not priced, and everyone's using it for nothing, for no price. And you have great ideas coming from the academic world that are, basically the browser, that were borrowed for nothing. No one paid really any serious licensing fee relative to the value of the actual invention for society. So you get that. And then you get the other flip side, which is you get a service that's free. And somebody makes the money on the advertising. The benefit to the user community is just not recorded anywhere because it's not a part of GDP, because it's a zero price.
There's another example, which is electronic mail.
Yes, yeah, great example.
Which is ruined because it's free. It's been calculated or stated. If you had to pay 1 cent to send an email, the entire spam problem would disappear overnight.
Yeah, well, yes, So that creates this really very interesting set of misunderstandings. I always find the zero price at the origin of a number of misunderstandings.
I would pay $1 a week to use email and not have spam. It would be a bargain.
I hear you. I feel your pain. I'm going to have a question from Aaron Ray, if I may. Why isn't more research, media coverage, academic focus on the examples of successful complex critical networks? For example, hospitals, aerospace production, internal core banking applications. These high risk, most critical networks are 5 to 10 times more secure, trusted, only cost twice what standard networks do while using COTS off-the-shelf technology. More should be understood. Well, focus on the question, I suppose. Why isn't there more stuff? And if there were more, what should the public be knowing about this issue? To any and all.
Oh, goodness. There's
I
a lot
don't
there.
think they want you to know the details of how it works.
Yeah, exactly.
Figure out a way to get into it.
In finance and health, there are a series of standards, but standards in the sense of minimum requirement that anybody who's involved has to pass and meet, and that generates extra costs, but also generates the extra security. But those norms have had decades to develop. So that we understood what to do there. And they're very special. Paul's point is exactly right. And it's really hard to learn them too. And it's almost by design that they shouldn't be easy to learn. I sort of noticed this in autonomous vehicles today, to give an example, where really as a technology, it's only a couple years old, for God's sakes. And it's not safe yet. and we're deploying them, boy. And anybody is surprised they get stuck inside wet cement, and it's going to be decades before we kind of figure it out. It's one of the very peculiar characteristics of our country that we're kind of willing to shoot first and ask questions later when it comes to new technology. It's really but that's what's happening there. It's a great question about why we end up here.
Just, if I may, just to tie in some of these complex critical networks, are they in point of fact international, or are they also primarily in the United States? Are there, in addition to fields, are there countries that specialize in them?
In banking, the norms are quite international. Yeah,
I think so.
For sure.
Yeah.
Don't know about much outside of banking.
Well, I find it interesting that the European Union is taking the lead on trying to put a choke on Google and other monopolies about their practices, and the United States is not doing what it should be doing. Let's put it that way.
Mm.
And the European Union gets a lot of flack about these so-called bureaucrats in Brussels that are running the world, but in fact, maybe it's a good thing that they're there.
Right. Well, it is 3:25 p.m. and hence nearing the witching hour. Might I ask if each of you, I guess in the same order, could give a 1-minute conclusion, what you want to say, what you want the audience to leave thinking about, and then I would just do a wrap up to get us to our 3:30. So Dr. Campbell-Kelly.
Yes, well, I suppose the point of my lecture, I find H.G. Wells the most interesting part of that talk. And it's the idea that the internet is something entirely new. But in a way, it's as old as the first encyclopedia in a sense. It was a way of distributing knowledge. One of the surprises really is that, and it was not anticipated by anybody that I know of, how it actually evolved into commerce and the idea of actually selling things on the internet rather than simply distributing information in that sense.
Thank you then. Dr. Ceruzzi.
Yeah, I think I have a sort of pessimistic attitude about where we're going. Silicon Valley seems to be producing endless copies of Instagram or Facebook, but you look at the fundamental innovations, they go back quite a bit to Bell Laboratories, which is pretty much gone, and other often the innovations came from European refugees who came to America after either during or after World War II, refugees from the Nazis or refugees from the Soviet repression of the Eastern European bloc. And where is the well gonna, the well, where's the future gonna come? Where did the future ideas gonna come from? And I feel very pessimistic about that. But I hope I'm wrong. That's all I can say. But I don't feel too excited about the stuff that's coming out of Silicon Valley right now, personally.
Thank you. Dr. Greenstein.
Yeah, I guess we're all looking at different parts of accumulation and accumulated processes. And so I guess the thing I stressed in my talk was the 1990s, which was sort of the high point of accumulated innovative things. Very much I kind of agree with what the others have said here. It did build on decades of work and ideas, and commercial markets at that point were very good at exploring new uses and putting them together in ways and combining them in ways that led to an accumulation of things that were really unanticipated, and that's really pretty special. And then going forward to make that happen again, I'd love to see that happen again. I don't think we're there now anymore. I have to kind of agree with Paul. It would takes a couple different things to get there. I guess that's where I was going. Accumulated processes are really quite special processes.
Well, thank you all so much. So we're going to get to the end up something of this webinar. Thank you all so much. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you very much to our audience. We do it for you. We can't do it without you. Your questions make it possible. Your questions don't have to end here. So if you have questions and they haven't been answered, or if you come up with new ones, please send them to me, randall@nas.org, RANDALL@nas.org. I'd be delighted to forward them to the panelists so that they can have the option to respond to you. I will also repeat, this has been recorded. It should be on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel within 24 hours and available in perpetuity. I will do a plug. If you liked this, consider joining the National Association of Scholars. We love members. We do stuff like these webinar series We would do other things as well, but do keep that in mind. We are going to be continuing to have webinars on a variety of subjects. How to teach African-American history, for example, is coming up soon, but we have something on personal computing, another webinar in this series on October 31st, Halloween. So we are continuing the science as well, and everything else under the sun. I think that's everything I need to say. So again, thank you all so much, everyone listening, and to our wonderful panelists.
Thank you.